We would like to acknowledge the traditional territories of the people of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta, which includes the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprising the Siksika, Piikani, and Kainai First Nations, as well as the Tsuut'ina First Nation and the Stoney Nakoda, including the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Wesley First Nations. The City of Calgary is also home to Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3.
Hello, everyone. On this National Indigenous Peoples Day, I'd like to welcome you all to the second webinar of the Alberta Futures Project. I'm Ken McKenzie, the Research Director at the School of Public Policy. As most of you know, the idea behind the Alberta Futures Project is to put together a diverse set of papers addressing key themes from the perspective of future challenges and opportunities facing Alberta as we emerge from the pandemic. These are pre-publications that will be gathered together into 3 ebooks, one on Alberta's economic future, one on Alberta's fiscal future, and the third one on the future of healthcare in Alberta. The last book on healthcare is joint with the O'Brien Institute for Public Health. We've been releasing 1 or 2 papers every week over the last month or so, and we'll continue to do so into July. Then we'll take a short break before we begin releasing some of the papers on health policy in August and into September. So keep your eyes peeled for those. Now, today's webinar, as I'm sure you will agree, deals with we have 3 highly qualified and informed experts to talk us through it all. Our moderator is again Danielle Smith, who did a wonderful job on our first Futures seminar in May. And without further ado, I'll pass it on to Danielle to introduce our speakers and get the ball rolling. Thank you.
Thanks, Professor McKenzie. Thanks so much for allowing me to be part of this, because I think these papers are really amazing and quite mind-shifting as well. And I think this topic today in particular is going to challenge a lot of people, because we have set a net zero by 2050 target at the federal level. But as one of our authors has pointed out, Alberta hasn't officially set a net zero by 2050 target here. Doesn't matter, because it does seem like the industry is making great strides towards that goal. And I think some of the things that we're going to be talking about today, as I mentioned, being quite challenging, is that change is probably going to come a lot faster than most people expect. So we've got a great lineup of speakers. Mac Van Wielingen, founder and partner. I have ARC Financial Corp, but also it looks like Viewpoint Group. He's going to have to tell us if he's rebranded there. Dr. Jennifer Winter and Dr. Chris Bataille have also co-authored a paper that we will discuss second. We're going to have just a sort of a brief opening comment from each of them, and then we'll have a moderated discussion. If you want to engage in the discussion, just send a note to, just click on the bottom where it says Q&A and type your question, and we'll be monitoring them throughout. Ashley's going to make sure that she flags the ones. The best way of doing it is to upvote if you can, so that I know that the questions that you want to pose are the ones that we'll get our panelists to answer. Now, without further ado, let me introduce once again Mac Van Wielingen, founder and partner of Viewpoint Group. And Mac, maybe I should start off with a bit of a question for you, because it seems like in Alberta, we have been fighting carbon pricing, fighting carbon taxes, all the way up to the Supreme Court. The Premier has said, okay, well, I now have to figure out what we're going to do here for carbon pricing policy. It does seem like Alberta's stance has been one of being oppositional. And yet, reading your paper, it sounds like the energy industry has really embraced this net zero target. And I'm interested in seeing how you see it. Does it look like net zero by 2050 is achievable by Canada's energy sector, and in particular oil sands? Let me put it over to you.
Okay, thanks so much, Danielle, and it's a real pleasure to be here. And thank you, Ken, for your introduction, and Jennifer and Chris. I think the reality, Danielle, is that there's been very strongly divergent views over the last number of years, and quite frankly, even over the last decade plus with respect to carbon and carbon pricing in Alberta. And I know I've mentioned to you directly that I've been advocating for a carbon tax to probably now 5 different premiers over the last 15 years for a number of reasons. And I think it has been slow in making the turn. As you point out, there's no question that the industry is committed to reducing emissions. And also, in my opinion, the Alberta government is swinging behind it and will swing behind it quite strongly as we move forward. And Danielle, if I could, if I'm allowed to be positive and to have a little bit of fun here, can I just carry on a moment?
You go ahead, you carry on.
Okay. And what I want to say is, again, in just to create some broad context and kind of an atmosphere here for these conversations, I just wanted to offer my view that there's no question we're going through massive change and transformation in the world energy system and in Canada's and Alberta's energy system. But I have this view that Alberta has actually entered a form of and forgive me for this, for some people feel strongly otherwise, a form of a renaissance. And my reasons are as follows, my principal reasons. Number one, our traditional oil and gas sector is now generating the highest level of cash flow ever in its history. About 70 billion is what we're expecting at ARC Financial. And I am founder and partner of ARC Financial, as well as I use Viewpoint as my family office. And we're expecting 70 billion roughly of cash flow from the entire oil and gas sector. And oil sands alone will generate, we believe, about $40 billion of cash flow. And what's fantastic about the oil sands industry is that it can maintain its production with very little capital. 5 to 10 billion dollars of capital is what we're estimating. And I don't think there's another subsector in the Canadian economy that's generating so much financial liquidity at this point in time. And also, there is, and Danielle, you alluded to this, an extraordinary amount of innovation going on within the energy sector, within the oil and gas sector. The oil and gas sector is the largest investor in clean tech in Canada. And the opportunities that are emerging in carbon capture and also hydrogen, and this is highlighted in Chris and Jennifer's paper, are really significant. And renewable energy in Alberta. Alberta is expected to lead renewable energy growth over the next 5 years in Canada. If you look at the energy sector broadly, oil and gas, but also include all the clean tech and the renewables and the hydrogen, it takes on a very different picture. But it's a bit of a Goldilocks set of conditions where we're generating so much cash from our traditional industry that's so important to make the transition and to fund debt levels in Canada. It combined with all the innovation and the technological advancements, combined or in the context of a much higher level of alignment with industry, and yes, I believe the Alberta government with the federal government to pursue decarbonization.
Thanks for that, Mac. And we're going to bring in Dr. Jennifer Winter next. She's an associate professor and scientific director, energy environmental policy at the School of Public Policy. I think, as Mac was pointing out, this amount of dollars that is now in the energy sector, I think, took a lot of people by surprise. It's a huge amount of money, $70 billion, which allows for the transition that we're talking about. But Professor, I was asking you off the air whether it was important for Alberta to set a net zero target. One of the things you mentioned was, well, it's more important to actually have policy that'll get you there than to set a target. I mean, I've been watching this since I think I started paying close attention in 1997 with the Kyoto Protocol, kept on seeing aggressive targets being committed to, and then no action. And I think that there is that that concern. That's one thing to set a target. It's another thing to put the policy in place. So give us some sense of we can move fast or we can move slow. Give me an idea of how you think Alberta should be responding to this environment with the kind of policy changes that you would like to see.
Absolutely, and good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. So what I think we're seeing in the last few years is increasing amount of commitment to both targets and policies to reach those targets globally. And I think it's important to remember that the transition to net zero is not just going to happen. Globally, it will be the result of concerted policy action and policy change that's going to take place over the next years and decades. And I also think it's important to remember that the transition globally can be slow or it can be quick in terms of the policy changes implemented by other countries. And that'll definitely affect Canada and it'll definitely affect Alberta. So the speed of global policy choices will determine the speed of the transition. And in the paper with Chris Bataille, Anna Canduth, and Sarah Dobson, we have two taxonomies of pathways for Alberta's transition to net zero, and that's a transformation versus transition. And so the transformation is sort of reflects a scenario where there's aggressive policy change globally, and that means aggressive policy change within Canada and Alberta to reform our energy systems and how we use energy, and versus the transition, which is more of a gradual change. And so I think the point I want to make is that within Canada and Alberta, planning is necessary to ensure that we're not left behind by energy market changes elsewhere, and can seize the opportunities that these transitions bring. So it's I think, yeah, it's really important that governments right now are not hoping for that best case scenario, which is transitions, and failing to plan for what's most disruptive, which would be the transformation. And when we think about a transformation of Alberta's economy and the Canadian economy, that's going to be incredibly disruptive for many industries, for how we use energy, and for people's livelihoods. And so it's like, I think the broadest point we can make is that it's incredibly important for governments to be forward thinking and thinking about different scenarios, and putting policies in place so that we can maximize the opportunities and mitigate the disruption from those different scenarios.
All right, thank you so much for that, Jennifer. It's probably a good time for us to bring in then Dr. Chris Bataille, Associate Researcher, Institute for Sustainable Development and International Relations. And if you could go through a bit of the modeling that you do, because I take Jennifer's point that you have to have good policy in place, but many of the scenarios, you've mapped out 62 scenarios, so obviously we can't talk about all of them, but 9 major assumptions to them. Some of them are within government control and some of them are not within government control. Like I'm looking at things like the cost of electric vehicles or the cost of hydrogen. These are things that are going to have a huge impact on the takeout from consumers, but it's sort of difficult to figure out how that's going to play in the overall transition. Maybe you can talk about some of the other aspects. So we have a sense of what's within government control versus what needs to be done in the private market with free enterprise and innovation.
Yeah,
Chris, go ahead.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So the transition to net zero out through to 2050, 2060, which is what's required to kind of keep the global temperature rise under 2C and hopefully down towards 1.5C. And that's from pre-industrial temperatures. That requires a whole suite of technologies get developed, and new systems of doing things and what have you get developed, and that they're commercialized and ready for take up by markets, right? And that's really a global thing. Like we need EV battery prices to come down, wind prices have come down, so electrolyzers for hydrogen, solar prices, what have you. And that's a bit of a collective business and government effort globally. Everyone has to kind of contribute, at least especially from the developed countries which can afford this, but then everyone has to participate in that. So that's something we're kind of we need that to happen for this all to be possible, to stay under these temperature values. Now, the other thing that's very much not under our control is we're heading to sort of 3 sequential peaks in terms of peak coal, peak oil, and then peak gas, right? And as we start riding over those peaks, there's going to be some very complex market dynamics. As demand slowly disappears, you want supply to gradually come down at the same time. So you get a nice, even, smooth transition. The problem is if there's a lot of miscommunication and some players believe one thing's going to happen, then another, you're going to see price spikes and price crashes. So you'll see really high oil price spikes, but you can also see negative oil prices like what we saw last April during COVID. So there's an element of cooperation that kind of needs to happen there. Now, what's in our Canada doesn't control the global oil price. That happens as a collective of global oil, global supply and demand. But what is under our control is putting in policies such that all of our end-use consuming sectors, be they building, transport, industry, what have you, all have very clear signals to them that you have to get to net zero within 1 to 2 stock cycles of your equipment. And very, very close to zero. And here's the innovation help, but here's also on the front end, but here's also the carbon pricing and regulations on the back end that kind of directs the whole economy in that direction. So it's a nice smooth transition for our whole economy. Now, the good news is Canada is swimming in competitive advantages in this space, and Alberta specifically. It's got world-class carbon capture and storage geology practically everywhere in the province. It's got cheap methane. It's got great wind and solar. It's got a very, very capable petrochemical industry that can take advantage. The transition is not just about EVs and batteries and wind and solar. There's a whole 30 to 40% that's heavy industry that Alberta is very set up to participate in. But the problem is Alberta's starting at 60 tons per capita, and compared to the Canadian average of 18 tons per capita, and we have to get the entire Canadian economy down below 1 to 2 tons per capita by roughly 2050. It's a big challenge.
All right, so that maps out the nature of the challenge. Let's see if we can get a conversation going to make sure that we're kind of all on the same page about what net zero means, what the target is, how quickly we can get there. And maybe I'll start with you, Chris, because one of the things that you introduced in the paper, you and Jennifer introduced in the paper, was that 2050 and net zero is just a stop along the way. After that, there's sort of a net negative goal. So let's understand what net zero actually means, and then just sort of push the vision out a little bit more so that we understand what the challenge is post 2050.
Yeah, so to tell this story properly, you have to actually start at the global level. Global CO2, in order to stay within the temperature band, we're just trying to stay inside, global CO2 has to drop from where it is today, somewhere around 50-ish total, down to, it has to get to zero, somewhere around 2055. And then it has to go into the net negatives, and with different targets for methane and nitrous oxide and the other greenhouse gases. So that means that basically energy supply and demand globally has to get as near zero as possible. And then you need negative CO2 emissions. So we have to be drawing CO2 out of the sky and putting it back underground. And there's 3 main ways to do that. One, you use bioenergy, right, which Canada as a whole is plentiful with. You combust it and then you take the CO2 and push it back underground. Or you do what's called direct air capture, where you use chemical cycles to haul CO2 out of the atmosphere and push it back underground. That takes a lot of energy. Now, Alberta is an ideal place to do that because it's going to be sitting on a lot of wind and cheap wind and solar, and it's got all the CCS geology that's needed to do that.
Do you want to add anything to that discussion, Jennifer, about net zero?
Yeah, just briefly, I think Western Canada is well set up to, like, I think, if the following conditions are fulfilled, and in that, like, if we effectively develop these technologies, and if there's credible policy signals for these investments, then Western Canada and Alberta can capture CO2 from the air, and that's about providing, then we have the opportunity to provide carbon capture offsets and credits to the rest of the world. It also requires a functioning global market in carbon offsets, which is, no small challenge. But so there's a question in the chat, is like, how do we get China and other large emitters on board with this? It's really about I think industrialized countries doing a lot of the heavy lifting in terms of the technology development, and then also doing a lot of the hard work in terms of emissions avoidance.
So if I'm hearing you, because we've got so much space in the Western Canada Sedimentary Basin for storage in our saline or salt caverns, then we could be capturing CO2 for the world through direct air capture, storing it, and they would be paying us for credits in order to perform that service for them. Okay, that really turns it around on its head. We've always been looking at this as nothing but a cost. So that's a way that we could get a revenue stream. Let me go over to Mac Van Wielingen, because Mac, one of the things that you introduce, you talk about net zero, but you also introduced the concept of a circular economy. And I wonder, are they the same thing, or is there some nuance that is a little bit different when you're talking about circular economy? What do you mean by that?
And the whole concept of a circular economy is to be able to recover waste products, recycle waste products, reuse waste products in ways that are beneficial for communities and society and commercially. And that's the thinking, that's the concept. And it's like a lot of this, I think there are a lot of conceptual frameworks and a lot of ideals. And that is one, but it's important to be able to think that way. I often think the most powerful catalyst of change in all of this would be to find more commercial values for carbon. That changes everything. And, I know, Danielle, you have an interest in that.
Mm-hmm.
But a lot of people who look at it and all the research going on, there's a lot of skepticism about it, but we're talking about long time frames. And we're talking about enormous amounts of research and innovation that's underway. But that would be an example, Danielle, of in a sense, an economic activity that could be viewed as being circular.
Well, I like the concept that you introduced as well about looking at carbon dioxide as a feedstock. And I think that changes the calculation for an investor, is that if you can look at it as a source of revenue, then it becomes a different conversation. Give me some sense of what you're looking at as potentially the most promising, because I think we've seen carbon dioxide used for enhanced oil recovery, although the federal government doesn't recognize that for this special tax treatment. But what would be some of the other things that look like they might be breakthrough technologies from what you've seen? What shows the most promise?
Well, I think, and I'm sure Chris and Jennifer have more insight into this, but I think the use of carbon to strengthen concrete is, looks very promising from what I've seen. And as cement and making concrete is a large emitter of CO2 itself. But if we can somehow convert CO2 and carbon into a product or a material that will strengthen concrete, and I expect that's going to happen, and it's already happening. And then there's lots of commercial uses as well, but nothing looks major at this point, Danielle.
Let me put it over.
I'm smiling a little bit because there's this funny little company that's created a vodka from carbon.
I've seen it, Erico.
Yeah, and so there's all sorts of possibilities, including creating fuels.
Let me put it over to Chris, because I know he does have a lot to say on this as well. And maybe I'm being a bit more bullish on the potential for developing useful products out of this, because I think you might have a bit more of a pragmatic approach about the amount of utilization versus the amount of storage that we need. But why don't we start on the utilization front, Chris, and tell us what, just building on what Mac has said, if we're going to capture it, if we're going to look at CO2 as a potential feedstock, what are some of the most promising opportunities out there?
Well, to be honest, speaking from the literature, and this is going to be counterintuitive to most people, but probably if at the beginning to get CCS going, probably the best use of it is enhanced oil recovery. is enhanced oil recovery from old depleted wells. And most of the older wells, they were not emptied. They were only maybe some of them 20-30% of the oil, what have you, came out. If you use what waste CO2 you have to do that, it's far less emissions intensive than very much less intensive than oil sands as we do it today, and even less intensive as conventional wells, especially as you go to the older wells and you recap them, because we have a very significant problem basically from the Yukon all the way down to Texas, and there's all these holes punched in the ground that are leaking methane. And we need to go back, and they all need to be plugged. But if you go back to them and extract what you can and then seal them properly, that's got a double benefit. Now, the interesting thing is the biggest feedstock up, carbon's one, but the problem is the really valuable carbon is going to be first biocarbon. Waste to a certain extent, biocarbon will have another value. Carbon captured from the air is going to have by far the most value, right? Because it's got that cyclical character that you're not net adding to the atmosphere. But the other two feedstocks that have a lot of value that people don't talk about are hydrogen and oxygen. So most of the hydrocarbon economy is made out of hydrogen, oxygen, and carbon of one sort or another. And we have the engineering capacity today to kind of approach that in a Lego-like manner and build whatever materials, fuels, what we want, cleaner fuels, but using existing processes. But we don't do it. We always start with fossil carbon now instead of other sources of carbon. Now, these are all things that Alberta is very much set up to do. And frankly, it does half these processes already, but with a different feedstock.
Jen, if you can build on that too, because I think a lot of Albertans look at this discussion of carbon pricing as a punishment, but we're sort of framing this in terms of the opportunity. So give me some sense from your perspective. What do you think the opportunities are as we look out to net zero?
So I think the big one I've already touched on is providing offsets, and I think the second really big opportunity is in repurposing our existing infrastructure. In that, all the petrochemical facilities, plastics facilities that are based on the current hydrocarbon economy, which we're still going to want to use plastics and have fancy toys like iPhones and iPads and things like that, right? And so it's repurposing the existing infrastructure to these new feedstocks based on not necessarily the oil sands or conventional oil and gas, but new sources of carbon, developing hydrogen, that sort of thing.
Okay, let me go to Mac, because Mac, you go through, and I think you give a nice table that shows that we're doing pretty darn well on the issue of environmental, social, and governance measures. And I think we've been battered black and blue by a lot of the critics in the international community. And I think that we need to sort of reorient around the things that we're doing incredibly well. So can you talk a little bit about how we compare to other oil producing jurisdictions on that measure? And that measure is so important now because it's being used as a measure of attracting investment capital. But give us some good news stories there about how well we're doing.
Yeah, well, and I appreciate you mentioning that. One of the reasons I feel so confident in talking about this is that 80% of our investors are international. And I think most people know that ARC Financial is the largest private equity firm focused on energy in Canada, and our international investors have been saying this to us. I mean, there are some issues, so I don't want to minimize those. And but they've been saying, and executives in the industry who are very involved in the international business have been saying, I've been hearing for just like decades in my career, that Canada's environmental ESG regulations or standards and our performance is as good as it gets in the world compared to other energy and resource suppliers. I mean, that's the critical contextual piece. I mean, if you're going to be involved in energy and resource development, you're impacting the environment adversely. And so, you need to have very, very specific strategies to deal with it. But when you look at it all, I mean, Canada has the one among the greenest electricity sectors in the world. And I believe we're the second largest producer of non-emitting hydroelectric power in the world. And the issue on the environment is emissions. So I'm always saying that. In my paper, Danielle, as you would have seen, over and over, I'm saying that. But when you look at everything else, including social factors and the reliability of Canada socially and politically and governance factors, we're rated right near the top among compared to all other suppliers of energy. And that is a point I just keep presenting over and over. But I appreciate the emissions issue, and that's why I make the comment in my paper that we need to break the back of the emissions problem to really move forward competitively in the market. And it's why I feel so pleased to see some of the recent initiatives that were announced just over the last week or two and that weren't referenced in my paper. You know, the Pembina Pipe TC Energy project to build a world-class carbon takeaway system and sequestration. And the big 5 oil sands companies committing to net zero. And in as much as some of them already had, it's sort of like the Alberta government, you were saying, some of them, and notably Suncor, hadn't. And so they're all there now, and Imperial. They're all there. It represents, I think it is 90% of Canada's oil production. And I'm talking to them, and I believe they're totally serious about this commitment. And so if we can break the back of our emissions problem, and then when you look at all our the other ESG and competitive factors, including the reliability of Canada as a supplier of energy, I think we've got a very strong competitive position. And I recognize, when I say that, I recognize it's in the context of a long-term diminishment of demand for hydrocarbons. And I put that forward in my paper because I don't want people to think that I'm arguing otherwise. No, I think that it's just that it's going to take much longer than I think. I mean, I do have a view it's going to take much longer than a lot of people think. And it's primarily because of the emerging and developing countries don't have the same infrastructure capacity. They don't have the same legal and regulatory clarity that can be trusted. And so the developing world's having to manage its own transition, the developed world, and then also finance the transition for the developing world. And
yeah, I think
very long answer, but I just want to throw in one other point, and that this is in the context of a lack of fiscal space now, post-COVID, in among developed countries, is that we're running the highest levels of debt we've ever had.
completely. And I'll come back to you because you've coined a new term as well, but I want to get Jen and Chris in on this discussion about how Alberta is doing. So as Mac mentioned, I think he looks at the transition in his paper. He says, whether it's 30 years or 50 years or 70 years or 100 years, I think Chris is quite a bit more aggressive about how fast we need to move. But Jen, let me just ask your perspective on this. When I look at ESG, when I look at our comparators to other oil producing jurisdictions, it does seem like we're high up on the list, but we don't seem to get credit for that. Is there something that we're missing? What more needs to be done? Or do we just need to be better at celebrating the progress that we're making? How do you see it?
So with these international comparisons, I worry about, sometimes I worry about a race to the bottom versus a race to the top. And by that, I mean, if, it's fine if we say that we're the best or second best or something like that, but we can still do better. And I think we still need to do better. So it's really about continual improvement in emissions reductions, other environmental performance, ensuring that local communities also receive the benefits from disruptive resource development, and just remembering that I suppose that we can be an example for the rest of the world, but it's only if we we really truly are the best in, like the best sense of the world, in that, being better than some other countries that I won't
No, I
point
get it.
out is not really a point of pride, right? It's let's be the best because we care about mitigating environmental impacts of resource development generally.
Okay,
I totally agree with that, Jennifer.
got it.
I
Let's
mean,
go
we
to,
could say our ESG is great, compared to, Saudi Arabia or wherever. I mean, that's not good enough. I mean, but there is a reality that if it's not our barrels, it'll probably be Saudi barrels. I mean, it is just a practical reality of it. But I still agree with your philosophy and your vision on it. Totally.
and we've got to be better, but I mean, this is the problem, is that sometimes the investment community acts like we're worse than some of those other jurisdictions. And it's fine to be encouraging us to be better, but I think that context is important, because you have another term that you use about us being the last barrel is the best barrel, and the best barrel should be a Canadian barrel. And I think that there's some good thinking behind that. Let me go to Chris though, because I don't want to sugarcoat how difficult this is to get to these aggressive targets. I wouldn't mind if you want to comment on what Jennifer said about how we rank in the rest of the world and why we're having a hard time punching through. But you go through and talk about what the reality is of getting to these targets, in how we build our buildings, how we build out our transportation network, how we deliver electricity. And I want people to understand what it is that you think we need to embrace as the challenge to get there. So Chris, you can either just sort of start by commenting on our reputation on ESG, but then I want to get into a little bit about what some of the details are about how to get there.
Okay, I'm going to start with the negative, and then I'm going to move to the positive, if that helps. So the negative is, the problem is we've had the technology, and it wouldn't have cost much in the Canadian oil and gas sector to dramatically reduce our emissions since we've been talking about climate policy. So with upstream fugitives like methane leaking from both oil and gas wells, minus 60 is pretty easy to do from where we were a few years ago, and minus 90 is doable at a relatively small cost. The last 10% is for safety, just preventing blow-offs and explosions and hydrogen sulfide leaking, what have you. So that's one area. We could have done a lot 20 years ago, and there's been a lot of pushback from the oil and gas industry that they wanted to, I felt like they wanted to get paid to do it when it's something, it should have been best practice, right? So that's one. Two, we make a lot of hydrogen already in Alberta. In order to it's to upgrade both at merchant upgraders and at Semcor and Syncrude, in order to make synthetic crude to help basically liquefy the bitumen and send it down the pipe. It's been, the Norwegians since the late 1990s have been using CCS on their hydrogen. The machines they use to make hydrogen for methane, they've been using CCS on those. And it doesn't cost a lot. We could have been doing that, frankly, and it was part of the 2008 Turning the Corner plan. If we'd stuck with Turning the Corner under the Harper Conservatives, we'd be in a much better space right now. So that's the negative. Frankly, we've been shirking our duties as a highly developed oil producer. Okay, so that's the positive. That's the negative. On the positive,
I was going to say, oh gosh, it gets worse.
Yeah, starting by the early 2030s, though, in order for us to hit reasonable climate targets, everything that is built in every sector has to be near zero emission. Okay, near zero or hopefully negative, one way or the other. That's buildings, that's vehicles, that's industrial machinery, what have you. We've got about half the technology we need commercialized to do that. The other stuff, we've got about 10 years to ramp up to do that. Now, that's the simple message. Everything new by that time has to be, but we're going to have a big lag in vehicles that are still running on combustion fuels, in buildings that are running on gas. And there's a big, Max mentioned this in calls that we've had. Yes, we can fairly rapidly clean up the oil sands and keep the existing reserves running out at a much cleaner level. So we're not just positive on all the sort of social ESG stuff, but we're positive on the emissions as well. And we calculated in the late 2000s, it would have been $5 a barrel to take emissions in the oil sands to virtually near zero, because it's a much more produced product as opposed to an extracted product, right? So there is an opportunity there. There's a mix of things in terms of the future technology, but also serving the all the buildings, vehicles, and industry that need to operate out for the next 20 to 30 years before we can get all the new stuff built that runs on electricity and hydrogen.
So do you envision then that more jurisdictions are going to do like Quebec has announced, saying by such and such date, I think they've said 2035, no more new combustion engine vehicles will be sold.
Yes.
Do you envision that being a Canada-wide policy?
And frankly, that it's not just Canadian, it's going to be North American, because the vehicle industry in North America, it'll start with personal vehicles because we know how to do that now. It's probably going to be mostly electric, except a few longer range things. The big question is in heavy freight, in trucking. We don't know, is it going to be electric? Is it going to be hydrogen? Is it going to be biofuels, or a mix of all of the above? But that's coming. Probably 2030, 2035 is going to be the cutoff date for light vehicles. Probably 2035, 2040 is the cutoff date for heavy vehicles. And it may move forward from that. And that's where most of the OECD is going.
Okay, I think it's important because hydrogen vehicles are an electric vehicle, but it is a totally different infrastructure. So I get that. One thing where I might have a disagreement with you, though, is on the phase out of natural gas for electricity and home heating, because in Alberta, we've got like 90% of our current electrical grid is essentially hydrocarbon based. And in addition, I can't even imagine the mechanics of trying to repipe or rewire every home for home heating.
We're not disagreeing there. Like this is the thing, the longest lived problem. Okay, within the energy supply and demand system, the biggest problem we have is all our built out buildings, right? So you go to New York, you go to Toronto, there's like all these buildings that are running on gas, right? And you can't just fill them full of hydrogen. The pipes aren't set up for that because it has to be at higher temperatures, and the hydrogen is corrosive. It eats away at the steel, right? So as the buildings come down, they need to be replaced with something that's running purely on electricity and hydrogen, but it's going to be a long time before we can replace that gas. And there's going to be a big market, for some form of renewable methane. So biomethane or methane made from, both biocarbon and atmospheric carbon plus hydrogen, because those buildings are incredibly valuable. What happens in those buildings are incredibly valuable. We're not going to pull them down anytime soon. So there will be a market for a replacement drop in hydrocarbons. That's a lot of what my research is about. So.
Fantastic. All right. I'm told by the organizers, you've got to get to audience questions, which we're doing now. So you can do me a favor if you go through and vote up the questions you most want me to ask our panelists. We've got a number of questions here. One of them is, how can I get these papers? So you can go on to the School of Public Policy website, and they're already posted in, if you go under publications, you'll be able to find them there. But let me put this first question from our audience to Jennifer. How do we get China on side with this transition? They built 267 coal-fired plants this year. I think that India is kind of going down that same track as well. Is that a lost cause to try to get some of those larger and still developing economies on side, or is there something that can be done from a policy point of view?
So I'll preface my comments by saying that I'm a perpetual optimist, and so I don't think it's a lost cause. China is implementing carbon pricing. We might wish that they're not building so many coal plants, but they are, they're in a, China is in a situation where it's aggressively growing its economy, and its citizens need energy and electricity to do that. I think the way to get China on side and other developing countries is to, one, do the best we can to reduce emissions and develop the technologies that they will then need to use to reduce their emissions in the future. And three, put together that that well-functioning offset market so that there are more options for developing countries to offset their emissions while they're transitioning to the developed stage.
All right, perfect. Thanks for that answer. Mac, I've got somebody thinking that we might be sowing the seeds of the defeat of our own energy industry by going down this path. Paul asked, this is a question mostly for Mac. Seems that the oil and gas industry believes it has to reduce its own emissions and all will be okay. What it seems to be missing is what similar emission reduction efforts by other industries and consumers mean for oil and gas consumption. Does the industry recognize that net zero by 2050 means very little demand for oil and gas? This is way more disruptive to the industry than reducing its own emissions. What do you say to that, Mac?
Well, it's true. And, I agree with the perspective, and I agree with the concern that, my whole perspective, as I attempt to argue in the paper, is that it's most likely going to be very, very long term, and we need to have a competitive strategy. We need a vision and a path and a competitive strategy, which is why, Danielle, I use that expression that the last barrel to be phased out should be the best barrel, and the best barrel should be Canada's barrel. That's an example of a competitive mindset.
Mm-hmm.
And our oil sands, as I said earlier, are arguably the most reliable source of oil in the world. And if we can get our emissions, just keep pushing our emissions down, whatever barrels are being used, Canada should have a significant place in that market. And if that view is wrong, in a sense, we've got the option value on the upside. And if the transition is much longer, if it's, I'm just going to pick a number. That's what I did in the paper. I mean, whether it's 30 years or 100 years, whatever it is, we need to have a vision and a path that retains the option value while we transition and invest. And I think, and people know that I'm very, very close to the energy sector. And I think when the status quo interests in the energy business in Canada start to get more aligned with developing new technologies and alternative energy sources, they will all feel more comfortable. And I love Chris's expression. I wrote it down here: swimming in competitive advantages. And Chris, if you don't mind, I'm going to use that in the future. I'll give you attribution. And it's true. It's a very, very important takeaway. We should be leaders. We shouldn't be victims of transition.
Mac, I want to, because I'm going to use your term, ESG, and I want you to explain a little bit, because I think that there has to be a bit of pragmatism that sets in here. We just saw our government in the last year and a half add $600 billion to our debt. There really isn't a way to address the federal or even the provincial or local government fiscal challenges without a strong and robust energy sector that has provided so much to our country in over the last number of decades. And so talk to me about that additional E that you're adding into the discussion of ESG, because I think that's really important.
Yeah, and it's interesting, Danielle, that you asked the question, and it's a one common sense piece in my thinking that seems to really appeal to almost everybody, and that is that ESG will be more powerful, actually, if you can conjoin economics with it. Economics shouldn't be an afterthought, and it covers everything. And economics is relevant to all stakeholders in various ways, whether it's through affordability or for governments, their tax base, or lenders and equity investors, and I mean, across, and employees, of course. In a sense, it rounds out the whole perspective on stakeholder governance and stakeholder capitalism. And that's part of my argument. It has to be right up front and right beside ESG. And there's a lot of different pieces to it. And the one that you just referenced about our fiscal position is a huge part of it. And I almost feel like apologizing to people when I bring it into conversations, because it only feels like it just feels heavy and only like a problem. And it is. And that's my world, which is finance. I don't mean to say that my world is heavy and a problem, but it is finance. And the fiscal position of Canada, when you look across all sectors of our economy and aggregate the debt, it's one of the worst in the world. And as an investor, the problem is not just the indebtedness, but our levels of productivity. relative to inputs into our economy has been stagnant now for about 6 or 7 years. And it's concerning, and it's not healthy. It's not long-term healthy. And so that's why I am arguing to governments, you need to think synergistically. Every dollar of capital we put in needs to work double time or triple time in solving these synergistic environmental problems.
It's a great point. The number shocked me. A $1.9 trillion economy, but cumulative debt across all, I think you're talking public and private debt, is $7.2 trillion.
Yeah, and it's actually worse than that, Danielle, because unfortunately the federal government nets out pension fund assets.
Oh boy.
Legally does not have it have the ability to access. So it really is more like 7.5 to 8 trillion against our $1.9 trillion economy.
Well, also one other point that you do raise, and I should mention as well, since Ken mentioned that this is Indigenous Peoples Day, the economic aspects of developing out First Nations, because there's a huge number of reserves that also have the potential for economic development as they develop businesses that are in the energy sector as well. So I know you make that point in your paper. I just wanted to draw that out. Let me go to Chris though. I've got another question from a listener. What about the lack of minerals available for electric batteries? Everything seems to be geared towards electric vehicles, etc. But this looks like to be a real bottleneck. Is there anything that we should be looking to solve that problem, Chris?
In the short run, it's a bottleneck, but okay, since the 1960s, we've had endless rounds of these, oh, this is going to run out, then that's going to run out. But human ingenuity is amazing in terms of finding new ways to extract resources. We're swimming in oil and gas right now because fracking was developed in the early 2000s, because in the sort of 90s, they realized there was a big problem, a lot of innovation occurred. So to be honest, I'm not that worried about there being a lack of lithium. It's interesting, there's lots of different sources of lithium out there. Where there might be limitations is copper and nickel. Canada has a lot of that. And a lot of it's going to be recycling it. We have to get better, as Mac was saying, we have to get into this more circular economy mode, recycling a lot of these key. It's nickel, copper, some of the rare earths, what have you. But again, developments are happening really rapidly where, cobalt, a lot of the cobalt comes from the Congo, and it's worse than the diamond story, to be honest, in terms of how human beings are being treated there. But very quickly, the battery manufacturers are working to get the cobalt out of the batteries, and there are several different battery chemistries in development and modifications of the lithium-ion chemistry. So I'm just less worried. And if you let the market talk, you let the prices of batteries rise and lithium rise and copper, the supply will come on. The question is, will the supply be clean? And that's where Canada does have, our regulatory system on our minds is very good. What worries me is that we're going to go to other countries for our supply, and neither the people nor the environment will be treated well there when those resources are extracted. So that is actually it's another ESG story, like what Mac was telling, in terms of, a healthy way of extracting these minerals. On an earlier comment about China and India, one thing we don't realize in North America is we're swimming in energy. We're swimming in coal, we're swimming in oil, we're swimming in gas. They're not. The only thing they have in high abundance is coal. And they're growing really rapidly, and to grow you need electricity. So they're building coal plants. Now, the Chinese are interesting, and as soon as they have a better option, they don't run out a coal plant to the end of its life like we do. If 5-10 years down the road there's a better way to build a coal plant or something different, a coal plant, they just rip it down and put up a new one, right? That tends to be how the economy, because there's so much demand, so much construction capacity, what have you. So I'm a little bit less worried about lock-in of carbon there, as long as options come along to replace those assets.
All right, I have proposed that instead of ESG, it should be ESG, I standing for innovates. Now we're getting a very complicated acronym, EIESG, but I think it captures kind of all the aspects that we're talking about here. Because innovation's an important one too. Jennifer, I had a concern that this conversation about net zero, negative, or net negative, that people would still be a little bit confused about what it all means. So let me pose this question to you from Lindsay to see if we can just get a little bit more clarity. Please comment on net zero versus simply zero. How to ensure that emissions are actually reduced versus traded or pushed into the future. Do you have a comment on that, Jen?
That's a really important point, and I think that's what Chris was talking about when he was talking about, you know, past 2050, how we want to go into negative emissions, and that's about, or you know, that's about getting past an absolute zero of no emissions whatsoever, or when we emit, we're capturing it. That's about, you know, getting into capturing more than we're emitting. I think, yeah, the challenge, of course, is on this transition to net zero is clear and transparent accounting for where there are emissions, that there are true offset emissions, and we're not putting off things into the future. And you know, that's going to take clear and transparent regulatory frameworks, and it's going to take clear and transparent markets, and also just true accounting for actual emissions. And you know, to be honest, we haven't got there yet. We have several, I'll call them proto offset markets that exist within jurisdictions. Like Alberta has an offset market. The federal government is working on recognizing offset markets, but it's still really in its infancy. And that's also part of the incentive for providing emissions reductions as we transition to net zero. It's like, you know, that policy transparency and the frameworks for interested actors to take advantage of the opportunities for emissions reductions.
Completely, because it's not that easy to get credit for nature-based solutions like planting trees or sequestering in soil or in fescue, right?
Yeah, you have to prove that it's an additional. Essentially, it's not something that you are already going to do that you're getting credit for. It has to be some new action that shows actual true emissions reductions.
All right, we're closing in on the end here. Let me ask a couple of questions about CO2 pipeline to Mac. Travis asked the newly announced CO2 pipeline from Christina Lake, the oil sands area, to Redwater area for sequestration is going to be capable of 20 megatons per year. What scalable capture technology do you think will be used by the producers, and who will announce first and when? I had a chance to talk with Martha Hall Finley and Suncor about the 5 oil sands collaboration, and it sounds like the difficulty around the capture technology is where a lot of the work needs to be done. Do you have some thoughts on that, Mac?
You know, I really don't think I can do a good job of answering that question.
Well, then why don't I pose it to Chris then? Chris, do you have an answer to that?
Yeah, sure. So the capture and disposal of concentrated flows of CO2 is an already commercial oil sands technology, and it has been for some time. Where the challenges are is post-combustion. It's when the CO2 is mixed in with a lot of atmospheric nitrogen. So, you know, when you're making hydrogen, the CO2 is concentrated. We could do that tomorrow as fast as you could build a facility and drill the wells. The post-combustion, where we might solve this first is actually in cement, oddly. One of the world-leading pilot plants for capturing over 90% of the emissions from the cement plant is in Edmonton. And hopefully in the next year or two, they'll fire up at Lehigh. And if they can do it with cement, basically all the physics are known, the thermodynamics are known, the engineering is known. The problem is nobody's done it on the scale we're talking about here. And a lot of the existing technologies can't handle the flow, and they can't handle the ratio of CO2 versus nitrogen. If it can be solved for cement, it could probably be solved for the oil sands, for post-combustion.
All right, Mac, let me give you an answer or a question that's right in your wheelhouse about investments. In order to drive investments in Alberta's hard to abate sectors to dramatically reduce emissions, is signaling these sectors' participation in a net zero national or provincial economy sufficient? Or does the scope of net zero have to be at the company industry sector level? I guess this is the question. It's one thing to say you're going to do it. What level do you need to do it? Is it making any difference in how we're being perceived from investment flows?
Well, I think ideally you want as much corporate buy-in and embrace of these specific policies and specific goals, and you know that will only help in the transition that has to be made. And so I think it's an inescapable part of the reality that the corporate sector needs to just get on side, and all these hard to abate sectors as well need to at least be open to all the possibilities of how it is that they might be able to abate the use of hydrocarbons and emissions, creating emissions.
All right. Well, thank you all for a really lively discussion. It sounds like a big challenge, but that I think everyone has a lot of optimism and confidence that Alberta's up to it. So once again, our guests today were Dr. Jennifer Winter and Dr. Chris Bataille. You can find their paper online at the School of Public Policy. Some of you have been asking what the name of it is. It is Alberta in Canada's Net Zero Future, Seizing Opportunities While Adapting to Change. And Mac Van Wielingen has written the paper, What is the Future of Canada's Energy Sector? Emerging Themes of an Optimal Pathway. You can also find that online at the School of Public Policy. I'm Danielle Smith. I'm handing it back on to Ken McKenzie for some closing comments.
That's great. Thank you, Danielle. Well, I think we could all agree that we really couldn't have assembled a better panel today. Just, really informed experts from different perspectives. I learned a lot, and I hope you all did as well. As Danielle indicated, I think we had a little bit of a problem with some broken links, but they're fixed now. At least I can access the papers by clicking on the links. So I think they're all up and ready to go, and I'd encourage all of you to read them for more detailed insights into these really important issues. And keep your eyes peeled for more papers coming out of the Alberta Futures Project. Happy National Indigenous Peoples Day to everyone, and have a good week.
Okay, thank you.